Well, I guess I'd like to think that I'm intelligent enough that I could just sort of rant and piece together a cohesive presentation of thought, which might be relevant to some kind of cultural transformation that's in the air on some level, help give form to it. I find myself in the midst almost of, although it's tough for me because I wouldn't classify myself as in the right, but the alt-right emergence is certainly a positive sign. I don't know how big it is, but I'd like to think that I've been helpful in trying to influence it into becoming more sophisticated in terms of having a more nuanced. Because I mean, what is the point of any kind of movement if it just evolves into something that ends up looking like any other agenda that is non-flexible, which is unable to actually address specific challenges if they're just a different rubric of standard responses to certain questions. I mean, obviously, so the reason why I guess I'm indicating some fealty towards this movement is because they are concerned with what I'm concerned with. Although if I were to start describing my politics, I'm sure a lot of those people would throw up. There's so many buzzwords that people are just programmed to react to, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. So perhaps I should start trying to cut out my own flavor of discourse, which I think is important for everyone to consider in these times of it's always going to be unfair to sort of but if you put attention onto anything, hopefully it can only make it stronger in a sense, even if it is causing interference. Maybe that interference will sublimate into something evolving. So the poster boy for what almost I dislike about the alt-right, I don't even know how he classifies himself, and I certainly don't spend too much time listening to all of his opinions. So many of them I find are, there are strains of this in other figures in the alt-right, and so I think it's, in my experience, most exemplified by this Stephen Crowder. So applying some kind of critical thinking, is fine, but when you I feel here there's a very real and palpable laziness on the depth of issues, and it's coming from ideological filtering. So it's a kind of willful blindness to facts and thoughts and ideas that are just inconvenient on an ideological level. And I mean, perfect example of this, I would say, is global warming. And I mean, global warming almost on one side, we definitely face a lot of ecological issues. Now, I can just imagine so many people in the alt-right, kind of blowing a gasket at this point. I'm talking about such obvious conspiracies, towards the leftist agenda. But, why can't these, let's call them ecological, even if it is propaganda, let's say, why can't it also be true? Like why can't it be convenient for the people on the left, and it is also frightening for us on an almost existential level, although, probably not deadly relevant in our lifetime, but, 3 generations down the line even, and I have an answer for this. I think that the reason why, everything that doesn't fall neatly into something that is conducive to this kind of idealist world vision, which is this, we just need to get back to basics, some form of micro-capitalism or anarcho-capitalism or something like that. And I've engaged with these people as well, which I think are, a lot of people have good motivation at the core of it. But, I mean, the level to which you have to filter the world to make this stuff viable is just, it's wish thinking. It really is. Like, you want to pick and choose everything just because it works for this, paradise land, which you can sort of, which needs to be real. I see the same thing as a kind of religious afterlife. I'm quite religious myself, but I don't believe in that kind of afterlife. That might already... Okay, well, anyway, let me... I probably will try to make videos about psychology and spirituality and things like that. And philosophy of, certain issues as they relate to lots of things. But putting that to one side and keeping on to politics, I understand, that is the simplest way to almost guarantee a libertarian agenda, or some kind of manifestation of a libertarian society. But you just have to look at, I think, certain facts that you can't get away from, which is that human beings as a species are now so successful as a species that just the level of success that we have in terms of just propagating ourselves, in terms of getting more numbers in our population, it's having environmental impacts, right? And if we now don't have some kind of political policy that, that can sort of account for this ability to impact on our environment, we're just going to keep on making our children inherit worse and worse situations just because we don't have the political capacity to do something about it. And the libertarian kind of ideology has a big problem with this because, it's just, well, the market forces are going to just always crank out some kind of, best fit solution, and so, and I mean, to me, that's really depressing because, it just means, as they say, we're going to run out of good materials that people just kind of, take from nature, and we're going to have to just have synthetic materials, to make everything. I mean, it really is, and that's the market solution rather than actually trying to impose some kind of structure to conserve. Now, obviously, imposed rules, that is obviously very dangerous. But, what is that compared to the slow danger that slowly just creeps up on everyone, and then we end up inheriting a shittier, or our children end up inheriting a far worse situation than the freedoms that we would have, because I mean, essentially that is almost some factor to the democratic deficit, which is just that, well, we can just steal from our children forever, we can just, we can make them inherit, the cost of our, and this, so obviously what I'm saying now, to a lot of people in the alt-right, they just, this person is completely bought into some kind of conspiracy, globalist, bullshit, because, because they have absolutely no way of dealing with what I'm saying. There's nothing in their political repertoire that answers this fundamental market failure. And so they have to just basically be deaf to it, like, oh, that's not a thing, that's not real, like the whole population could live within, the state of Texas, and just in the state of Texas we could grow enough food for all the people, And I mean, my answer to that is just, physically go to India, physically walk the streets of India, and just, because I mean, the sort of ideological pampering, to me, it's the same level of ignorance that, is decried of the SJW people, of having this ideological bubble to support, how convenient that global warming must be a conspiracy, like, just so we can have this continuing free market or whatever. Now, I'm not opposed to the free market. At heart, I'm very worried about preserving libertarianism. I mean, in its fundamental form, as a politically viable, structure that is woven into the republic. It is very important to me, and that in the midst of dealing with economic restructuring, on a fundamental level, which at some point we're going to have to get to. Either that, or there's going to have to be some kind of, some kind of apocalypse scenario. I mean, is that simple? Because the market is not going to be able to. I mean, the market already is under tremendous. I'm going to have to get into those details. So I've opened Pandora's boxes, which I'm not even. Fully, these perhaps could all merit their own particular discussions, because now, okay, so just talking about global warming. I mean, so I guess let me give my own, sort of factual rant on the state, or the state of knowledge on global warming, just so you can kind of see my level of engagement with this topic. So, yes, technically, you understand the word technically, because I'm going to make a huge concession, but you must understand that in the context of my thesis, it's basically irrelevant. Technically, we cannot prove man-made global warming. Okay. I think scientists, kind of try to use puffed up language, because they're basically saying that, on some kind of statistical inference, we should guess that it is going to be man-made global warming that is going to threaten us almost existentially. Okay. Now, this, I think, is a very important illustration to make, is that 50 years into a complete ecological apocalypse, right? So let's just say we start actually experiencing an ecological apocalypse, which definitely starts and is just mass deterioration of everything. Everything just starts breaking down, and we've experienced this for 50 years. Scientists at that point, I believe, would still not be able to explain how that was caused by man's involvement. There would technically still be scientific speculation as to, well, was it just some kind of solar event, mixed with, some other factors, because to be able to understand how an ecology regulates its own, sort of environmental, I mean, in a sense, it's analogous to, an economy. Like a lot of people try to explain what's going on in an economy, and it's kind of always up for a debate. People don't even know, on an economic science level, people try to fix it with Keynesianism, and that kind of, failed, and people try to fix it, through some other kind of philosophy of how to gear the system to keep it afloat, and sustainable without, sort of recessions, being precipitated from a structural kind of level. And people don't even understand a completely man-made system and how to, keep it stable, right? And yet you expect scientists to prove beyond a shadow, or to say, we know that if we do this, it's going to destroy the environment. Yes, we can never know that. Even as it's happening, we won't know how we messed it up, because we wouldn't be able to work out exactly, well, we screwed up the insects, which screwed up that thing, which screwed up that thing, we probably won't be able to trace the actual, sort of chain breakdown after it's even happened, There's this line in, and I understand that this is just to illustrate the point. This is not a proof by any means, but there was a line in "Thank You for Smoking," where they had a scientist on the payroll, who the main character of the film says, the scientist was so brilliant he could disprove gravity, and my point just is that even science as it is structured, in the realm of epistemology, which is that's a kind of a separate issue to broach altogether. But these are things that you don't play with, and you certainly are not in this kind of scenario. The ultimate answer is we don't know. The question, does not knowing for certain mean that we do nothing? The answer is obviously no. No rational scientist would think that. I would like to think that even the scientists which are completely committed to the idea that it's only the sun would have enough, sort of self-skepticism about, that claim, that they would forego their own particular expert opinion on the matter to be conservative. On this point. And that is really overplaying the opposition, because I'm going to pick the scientists at MIT. They think it's even worse than the conservative predictions. They think we have already played with fire on the, and yeah, I guess that's kind of exhausts my position on it. And to sort of, yeah. So, also another way to illustrate my point against Stephen Crowder, which sometimes he just says things which I find are just, they kind of touch on some level of, intelligent interface with a particular issue, but he only goes so far. He only extends that critical capacity to a certain level, and he just stops. And the reason why he stops is because otherwise you wouldn't be able to extract a convenient ideological, prescription, which wonderfully and magically always fits up so well with this particular brand of, conservative politics or right-wing politics. And, to me, this is very unimpressive. This is just like, well, from something that what he said makes me think that he wasn't natural, or that he wasn't born American, maybe Canadian or something like that. But I'm not trying to cast aspersions. I'm just, I got the impression that he was, he's immigrated, so but he's North American in essence, or something. He's at least North American in essence. But this fanboydom core of a kind of I mean, it just, to me, it reeks of a level of demagoguery, of trying to craft a particular front, which is easy for his audience to engage with. So, I mean, my basic criticism is that he's too popular. And that So, I mean, let's just say that his politics wins out, or is the somewhat the watered down version of the alt-right that actually ascends to, some kind of focal point in terms of restructuring America on some cultural level in terms of the political landscape. Let's just say that's what happens. I mean, what does it look like? To me, it's the right side version of the same kind of group tribalism, which is happening in terms of the SJW. There are a lot of things to talk about the origin of because it's interesting. I would say that let me not even make that particular point, as it probably leads us going nowhere. But the point is that you do need a particular vision. Okay, I guess this is the problem that I have with Stephen Crowder, is just his vision is a caricature of something that feels comfortable. And it doesn't have a kind of a real rigor built into it. It's just the kind of it's repackaged nationalism in some sense, I mean, and yes, he's trying to channel a lot of that towards, just reaffirming, these absolute, the absolute goodness, of the constitutional supremacy, in this blinding, perfect instantiation of freedom, that it is the beacon for. And, I just look at this and I just think, I mean, everything that Madison said when he was, when they were designing the American system, which was never designed to be democratic, what is his opinion on these sorts of things? The level of sort of cherry-picked educational, it really is. Listening to certain Americans talk about politics, it just it boggles the mind, in just how they can, on some level, be so ideologically primed with, certain readily available facts, just about world politics and about ideology in general. And that universe, really, I mean, like, if you compare it to some, in terms of the historical knowledge that's out there, and, it just is such a gerrymangled, sort of cosmology that it just, it literally is scary. It's interesting as well, because I'd say that, I mean, Alex Jones, I mean, I have a lot of respect for. I think he definitely has real integrity, and he talks a lot about, the mind, being, it's almost one of his themes, in terms of the programming of the mind, and just watching him evolve his, and nuancing his, critiques and things like that, and developing sensitivities for certain things. I do think that you can take a lot of, that almost spiritually packaged, healthy skepticism and apply it, you know, to your own context. And, you know, yes, you can see a lot of people on the so-called left, you know, which are just so insane, you know, that you can't even have a conversation with them about real things. But on the right, there is still this extreme laziness to just sort of I'm just going to repeat myself, but just to challenge the vision of, you know, like what, it's like there really is this blueprint ideal of a society, and it has to have these particular, you know, economic features, let's say, and things like that. And I understand that, you know, that is the simplest way to think about a libertarian society functioning. And okay, I guess my problem is that I would even be happy with that if it wasn't so risky for everything. You know, I mean, yeah, okay. So this, I think, is a natural segue into me talking about my particular slant on these matters of ideology and economics. I have what is called the classical Marxist mentality, which is, I'll post a link to the Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens, one of his first TV appearances, I believe. He's giving the basic Marxist spiel, which is that Marx really thought that capitalism was a great thing. He really did. He thought that it was the greatest engine that humanity has ever, you know, touched, you know, in terms of delivering it the ability to access more energy and, you know, potentially to do a lot of things. And yes, everything in history before it has been awful, you know. And basically the basic Marxist problem with capitalism is that it doesn't last forever. It breaks down after it's matured. Okay, that is the simple critique of Marx. Now, with this inevitability, which he kind of proved mathematically and from a kind of structural standpoint, then you had all these huge adaptations and deviations from Leninism and all those sorts of things, which I even have a video that kind of goes into this specifically. But basically, Leninism, state socialism, has really nothing directly to do with a Marxist understanding of history and economics. Okay, I can go into more detail on this, and I understand that a lot of people are just going to think, oh, well, this falls into, you know, the basic critique that we have of you people, which is, you know, oh, well, everything that has called itself communist in the past, you know, you're just saying that isn't communism, but we all know that that's what communism is, or something like that. Yeah, really neat. Noam Chomsky has this wonderful delineation where he lays all these things out quite nicely. I mean, I think that is my basic critique of the alt-right, is it just falls into these you know, high school history, American history teacher, you know, sort of, you know, bullshit answers to oversimplified historical narratives, which students ask about. And, you know, I mean, yes, there's a lot of very stupid people out there who call themselves, you know, left, and they're kind of the extreme left, or, you know, I don't even know what to call Leninism. I mean, it was called authoritarianism, I think, for a very good reason. Okay, so I'm not a Leninist. Okay, I was going to sum up this point now. But really, my basic problem is that if capitalism could survive, that would be great. But the truth is that it cannot go on. Capitalism. It would be better if I just made a whole video just on economics on this particular kind of point. But people have to recognize that capitalism, even in the West, died under Reagan. Reagan kind of had a fake miracle in terms of economics, which was funded by American savings. So if you actually look at the consumerism that looked like some kind of resurgence of capitalism during Reagan, and you just measure the savings, the average savings of Americans, that's what funded it. So somehow, under Reagan, they convinced people basically to buy themselves out of what otherwise would have been a recession and what would have looked like the tail end of capitalism. And so capitalism kind of had a fake life extension from then, which has been propped up since then just from economic, it's smoke and mirrors, it's just been, and this has been perpetuated because of the petrodollar and things like that. This has been allowed to continue. And in a sense, this is how the whole world is financially hinged on some level. But, this even is only one level because on some level it's a political problem, a geopolitical problem as well, that involves trade, that involves economics. Without so many things that have entered into the mix, we probably would be in World War III right now already, because, militaries have departments of people that do calculations, and they work out the rate of population growth, and they work out what you comfortably need to have a functioning economy. This is why Japan went to war in the Second World War, is because it didn't have any oil, which was a death sentence for its economy. So it literally had to go to war. If it didn't take islands that, had some kind of, they would have just run out of oil. I'm not saying that, they didn't do anything before that to precipitate, hostility or whatever, but, this is an economic thing, is that economies need certain resources. They need access, the spice must flow, it's that sort of concept. And if you have the real politics of nation states into this mix, it's just horrendous. Already we would have had a lot of problems if it weren't for the interconnectedness of our economies. So capitalism in the West, don't want to bring in too many issues, because can't make ideologically clear conclusions considering too many issues at the same time. But obviously you have to throw in a lot of stuff in looking at the current challenges. So this idea of going back to some kind of fairy tale, idealistic capitalistic model that, if we all just reverted back to it, we'd be able to fix our culture, we'd be able to fix, sort of family integrity, and, people would have a healthier psychology of, self-motivation and all these sorts of things. And also money itself is one of these problems. In terms of the source of money and, fractional reserve banking, whatever you want to call it. if we revert back to a system, you have to realize that we're revisiting a system which wasn't perfect. It did have flaws. It did precipitate its own depressions and recessions. And it did have certain structural limitations which aren't necessary. And you could say that, yes, well, we traded those limitations for a mixed bag of things that are definitely shooting ourselves in the foot at some level. We did kind of probably profit from the situation. The problem with real money essentially is just that you don't have an inflationary supply of money. It is very hard to actually to keep pumping new money into the system, and doing so is just costly and not useful. In order to derive frozen labor, I mean that's the only reason of finding new money is allowing the society to freeze more labor, which is itself a fiction. I mean, it can never be done, and when you agree that real money is frozen labor to a certain value, that is not true. I mean, that is also a fundamental kind of flaw in real money. It's going to be relatively more true to some and quite less true to others. And, that is, you could say, well, that is just some kind of necessary evil. You still have the problem of not being able to increase the money without, and not having a growing pool of money is just, you can just look at the history of the Roman Republic and how they suffered from running out of coin, and the great, lengths that they went to try and alleviate that and the economic pressures that it put on their society. Yeah. Okay. So if you try to go back to some kind of older model, you don't get better necessarily, right? You trade a simpler bag. You're trading down in a sense for kind of more security, but with stark limitations. And then the other problem is that we have a whole array of new challenges as a modern society, you could call it, or the sheer scale, and it's not going to go smoothly. And the old model of the Republic does not have the capacity to deal with the problems that we have today. Ecologically and just in terms of population itself, we never used to have issues with, population would kind of fix itself, not fix itself, but, it was somewhat stable or growing at such a slow rate that it was a negligible concern. I mean, right now, the later we actually find some kind of workable policy, because at some point in the future, people are going to say, well, are you saying that you really didn't realize that if you lowered the population, you multiplied the wealth per person in some sense? I'm not talking about socialism. I'm just talking about White's law, it's called, which is that the wealth of a civilization is calculated by the energy available to that civilization per person. And so if you calculate it like this, the peak of our civilization was in the 70s, and we've been in a decline ever since. And peak oil, oh yes, this is the other thing that Stephen Crowder treated awfully. I mean, peak oil has been misproven. I mean, the thing about peak oil, I mean, yes, now we're fracking for oil and things like that. And I don't actually have don't actually know how much it costs to frack for oil. But the point about, first of all, I think if you look at the actual numbers of like real economic whatever, I mean, the global economy has shrunk. I mean, like, how would you expect peak oil to have played out? What would have happened? And I think everything that has happened in recent economic history, and that's what peak oil would look like. I mean, it has manifested exactly as, almost in the best case scenario. Still people are putting things under the rug as much as possible. But you read a real economic newspaper. I mean, I guess also the point about peak oil is that it doesn't even have to be that the supply of oil the demand for oil has shrunk. That's my basic point, is that the demand has almost artificially and magically fallen underneath the supply. And so there isn't that peak oil pressure. But I would say that we did actually meet that peak oil pressure, and prices did reflect that, and it has beaten demand below. And I mean, also how it does this is just the oil that we do have access to. We might have the supply in terms of the quantity, but the cost and the expense of acquiring that oil, it's much more expensive oil, So it's like, I mean, I live in South Africa, so we've got gold mines, and a lot of them are not profitable to run. But when the price gets to a certain point, they become profitable, So they switch that mine back on because it's incredibly expensive to get, ounces from that mine. But the supply will increase because there's a greater threshold in terms of being able to pay. And so I don't know how you measure these things in relative terms. I mean, in a sense, nothing in this world is ever depleted. In a sense, it becomes relatively more expensive. Or we make it synthetically. The Sasol technology to turn coal into oil, and we certainly still have a shit ton of coal. So what? Yeah. Okay. So I've digressed from the point, but yeah. So I mean, to look past these schismatic, and problematic, challenges, just so we can have our very simple Republican, pie, which, is going to, why can't, the government just get off our backs so we can just get to the business, of living our lives out, in the natural harmony, that just sort of exudes our American way of life. I mean, is just I mean, to me, it's kind of like, that religious wish thinking of, just having a very much like an us and them, kind of in crowd, out crowd, which, I mean, if you turn that, if you want to light that up as the example of how to get politics right, how to fix politics, it turns very nasty, in the geopolitical scene that has the challenges inherent into it, when we have these a very great potential for radicalization in terms of nationalism to flare up. Yeah, I understand, everything I say just sounds like, some kind of globalist, I mean, I guess I don't know how to weave this into the conversation politely, but the thing that I really want to not see happen is that horrible prophecy by that serial killer. What was his name? Marilyn Manson, or no? Manson. What was his first name? Was it not Mark Manson? I know that there's another Mark Manson, but the sort of the psycho semi-cult figure, religious person, who had that prophecy that, the world is going to devolve into a race war. And it would be wonderful if we could just make it so that that guy wasn't, the accurate prophet of, the politics of the future. I didn't want to get into a political, racial kind of point, but I do think that there is this general feeling that the people on the left criticize the people on the right for, which is having this kind of vague, ethnocentric, kind of vision. And it's kind of populated with these figures of like a stereotyped good and evil kind of scenario, and we really do need to look at issues on a far deeper level. And I guess, and not just stop and reaching a fudged conclusion on an issue, which just so happens to conveniently slot itself in to the picturesque political landscape, which doesn't offend, your particular ideology. Because, I mean, that's how I would say I am further along than the alt-right. And I would call myself a left-libertarian, or a left Marxist. In that I see all the challenges which disallow me from endorsing capitalism. I mean, I do believe that capitalism still has some life in it, and we should definitely keep it around for as long as possible as we try to transition into something that preserves everything that we enjoy about capitalism. In terms of the individual freedom, you know, and this is a real challenge, because I don't even know, you know, the answer of how to do that. I mean, it's going to take creativity. It's going to take we have to adopt some kind of alternative structure. So somehow we're going to have to create a political landscape which somehow gives us the same economic opportunity to be creative and express freedom, you know, and in a distinct way. We have to transfer that to some kind of political. This particular topic that I've just raised now is, I know it probably sounds quite ludicrous to a lot of people, but yeah, I'm going to probably make my next video will be purely on economics and understanding the constraints that force us out of the dying capitalism and into something else that hopefully can provide more, or hopefully at least just as much. And the reason of doing this is because of the diminished returns that capitalism starts giving, and then basically as it starts giving diminishing returns, it also threatens its own life. That's the problem with capitalism, is that it doesn't just slow down. When it slows down, it actively kills itself. You know, it's basically, as soon as it starts, it's like a fire. As soon as it starts dying down, it's practically suicidal at that point, because it's just the flame that persists is finishing up the air supply to further suppress itself. So it's an ugly thing, you know. And Marx, for example, spoke about this quite poetically when he said, you know, the system will beg to be overthrown as it's seemingly giving birth to something new. And we have to be very careful that that in these sorts of times, when we don't fall prey to opportunists, especially with people with an ultra-right or ultra-left agenda. You know, I mean, people who call themselves Leninists. I mean, really, these people are I mean, Lenin, even in his day, he had to be very deceptive about his own politics. I mean, he was thrown out. He was despised by a lot of Marxists, who he later had to kill after he kind of played his Jekyll and Hyde trick. After basically duping them with false literature, kind of pretending, you know. People really did not like, or the classical Marxists really did not like the vanguard socialism. It was not palatable to them, and that's why there was that schism between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. But anyway,